Putting us together with sponsorship from the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, and I'd like to welcome you to this year's Youth Entitlement Summit. It's I guess the third one, or the second one. Well, is it the third one? Yes, the third one. And this year we have quite the mix-up and quite an interesting and engaging summit planned here. Just to give you a quick background, today is the day of basically hearings and panel where experts will just testify on what younger Americans are facing in the future. So today's going to be a lot of substance. We're building up from last year's declaration, where a lot of areas were highlighted for young Americans and areas of where we need to pay attention with fiscal responsibility. We are glad to have many supporters in our cause to raise the cause of intergenerational collaboration and awareness when it comes to fiscal responsibility. With that, I'd like to introduce one of the YES co-chairs, honorary co-chairs, Ambassador Jim Jones. Just so that you would know, he's a co-chair with Secretary George Shultz and former Senator David Durenberger. So with that, Ambassador Jim Jones, would you mind coming?
Well, thank you very much, Jerry. I want to congratulate you and Corey and all of the leaders of this movement. About 25 or more years ago, a young fellow named Paul Hewitt, sitting over here, sort of became the staff director of AGE, Americans for Generational Equity, and Senator David Durenberger and I were the co-chairs of that. And the whole purpose of that was to recognize that if we took the fiscal policy that we had at that time going forward, we're going to create such large deficits that there would be the opportunity for real social conflict between the young and the old. Fortunately, in the 90s, we got a hold of that through a combination of tax increases, spending cuts, and a good economy, and we had surpluses. But in this decade, it's gone back to huge deficits. Now we have what I think is a very, very serious social problem on our hands, going to grow every year. So we regenerated AGE a couple of years ago, and Richard Fairbanks over here, who's had a distinguished career in foreign policy and in private law practice, and I were co-chairman of that. And we soon discovered if we want to make a dent, we're not going to make a dent by just having those of us who have many years behind us trying to preach the same old message. But if we're going to have real progress and get this fiscal policy under control, it had to be led by those of you who are going to be affected most by these growing deficits, the young people of America. So last year we had our first YES Summit, and it was a terrific start. And I think this year is going to be a great move forward because of all of you at this table and all of you here in this audience. Your voices have to be heard. They have to be heard effectively. You have to know the issues, and in order to be effective when you're talking to members of Congress and people in public life. So I congratulate you for organizing this again. And in order to know what the situation is, you have to know and hear from the person who's been fighting the front line battle on these budget issues. We're very, very pleased and honored to have us today the chairman of the House Budget Committee, John Spratt of South Carolina. He has done truly yeoman work in trying to bring the issues of fiscal policy and budget policy before the Congress and before the American people. He's done a terrific job, and he's one of those that is the kind of person you want in the foxhole with you. He has real courage, real insights, and I think we're in for a real treat today to hear from Chairman John Spratt.
Hi, Chairman. Good morning. I'm pleased to have a chance to speak to the next generation, speak to you about something of particular importance. I go to college campuses and other places, see young people just a bit younger than you are, and preach to them the importance of this issue. And I don't know whether we're getting through it or not, but what I want to talk about today is the fiscal condition of the federal government, on the word, the budget, and the deficit. What I have to say is laden with numbers. I've tried to take some of that out. It's hard to make pleasant under any circumstances, but it's vitally important because the debt we're accumulating today may be the debt you have to bear, the burden you have to bear some years from now. For perspective and to show you the political and policy complexity of this issue, let me go back to the book of Genesis, so to speak. To the Congress I joined 26 years ago when Jim Jones was the chairman of the Budget Committee. And I'm sure he remembers well the struggle with the whole issue of Reaganomics. Under the sway of President Reagan, Congress passed some of the largest tax cuts in modern history. At the same time, we embarked upon the largest peacetime build-up of our military. As a result, not surprisingly, we were looking at deficits as far as the eye could see. And by the mid-'80s, it was clear that no supply-side phenomenon was going to grow us out of these deficits. We needed a multi-year plan, and we needed a process that made us adhere to, stick to that plan. 3 senators, Graham, Rubin, and Hollings, came along with such a plan. The deficit for 1986 was $180 billion, or projected to be. They proposed to take this deficit divided by 5, and each year to chip $36 billion off the bottom line to the point where 5 years out we'd have a balanced budget. And if Congress didn't stick to this goal, they proposed automatic across-the-board cuts or sequestration. Part of my purpose here is to let you know, just to give you a bit of the history of budget process, because I consider it a critical part of getting our hands around the situation we have on our desk today. Graham, Rubin, Hollings took effect in 1986 and ran into problems almost immediately. First was, showing you how difficult it is to estimate or project, the deficit wasn't $180 billion as projected, it was $221 billion. And as for sequestration, it lasted a few months and the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional because it's administered or would be administered by the GAO. Now all of this is history, past history, but it's one way of explaining why we have found this problem so compelling, so complex, so hard to resolve. As Graham Rubin petered out, Democrats insisted that we'd come to the table and negotiate only if everyone was at the table, meaning the president or his team, and only if everything was on the table, meaning tax cuts and defense spending. In the first year in office, Mr. Bush, first President Bush, demurred to our proposition. He said the deficit is working its way out. We're getting the deficit down. There's no reason for that kind of intervention. But when the deficit began heading towards $300 billion, Mr. Bush could no longer maintain that argument, and he agreed to what we called then a budget summit. The summit droned on for the better part of a year in search of consensus. When agreement was finally struck, it was built on the structure of Graham, Rubin, Hollings. It capped discretionary spending, subjected all the spending that came out above that cap to automatic across-the-board cuts. It curbed growth in entitlement spending and set up a rule called pay-as-you-go, pertinent to this day, to today's speech, because we're doing just the same right now, putting it in statute. PAYGO provided that any increase in entitlement spending had to be offset, either with equal entitlement cuts elsewhere in the budget or with new dedicated tax revenues. And likewise, any tax cut had to be offset as well, so that there was no damage done to the deficit or the bottom line. Well, the Bush Budget Summit was a good compromise. If the results were eclipsed by a recession, you could hardly tell that anyone had done anything to the deficit. If anything, it got worse. Deficit increased, and as a reward for his diligence, President Bush lost the next election. It's easy to be an armchair pundit and call the shots, but as Mr. Dooley put it, this ain't beanbag. And it's almost impossible to balance the budget when the economy is bucking a headwind of a recession. President Clinton came to office committed to deficit reduction. There are lots of things he would have preferred to do on February the 19th, his first major piece of legislation, He sent us a 5-year budget plan to cut the deficit by more than half over the following 5 years. In addition to this 5-year format, the Clinton budget raised taxes, restricted entitlements, capped discretionary spending, and also imposed across-the-board cuts. In other words, it did something to everybody, enough to make everybody, every stakeholder mad. And when the bill finally came to the floor, I don't know how many of you were here watching the process, but it was a dramatic play out on the House floor, passed by one vote in the House. Marjorie Meslinsky cast that vote, and by one vote in the Senate, the Vice President kept close to cast that vote. That shows you how a narrow margin we finally put the Clinton budget through. Well, a good budget converged with a good economy. The Cold War came to an end. The bottom line of the budget got better and better for 8 straight years. Now, I'm not saying that everybody lived happily thereafter. Democrats lost control of Congress, for example, indicating once again how fiscal responsibility is not necessarily women. Not at the polls, anyway. In 1996, Mr. Gingrich and his fellow partisans sought to shut down the government. Well, of course, passage of their budget. It shows you how deep passions can run over issues of this kind. A couple of deep entitlement cuts with more tax cuts. They weren't successful. In the following years, the 5-year plan approached completion. The President came to us. He initiated this. President Clinton came to us, the budget principals in the House and Senate, and said, look, I'd like to see us try to converge early rather than later on a budget solution. As a consequence, we'd like to see you start meeting now. And to prove the President meant what he said, this is rare. Every time we met, the President's team was on the field. Frank Raines, Bob Rubin, Erskine Bowles. The President's proxy was in the room, and it was clear he was ready for a deal. But the outcome was a bipartisan 5-year plan that would balance the budget in 1998 for the first time in 30 years. The balanced budget agreement of 97, mind you, didn't just drop in our laps. It was a culmination of efforts. This is pertinent to right now in the situation we find ourselves in. Efforts that took 13 years from Graham, Rubb, and Hollings to the BBA of 97 to resolve the problem. The lesson to be learned from this experience is this. There's so many ways to duck, dodge, bob, and weave that everything needs to be on the table. Everyone needs to be at the table, especially the President and his team, and for sure the congressional leadership. The budget talks are to take off and actually work. By the fiscal year 2000, this is phenomenal to recall, but it's actually true. The budget was in surplus to the tune of $236 billion. We've finally done it. We actually paid off debt between 98 and 2001. So George Bush came to office the next year with an advantage that few presidents in recent times have enjoyed. A budget in surplus, big time surplus. $5.6 trillion over the next 10 years, according to his economists. On the Saturday morning when President Bush rolled out his budget on the radio, I spoke after him. I warned him against betting the budget on blue sky estimates that could vanish in the blink of an economist's eye. I warned further that we appeared to be sitting on an island of surpluses. We were surrounded by a sea of red ink. Our long-term unfunded liabilities, Social Security and Medicare, which is still an unresolved problem at the present time. The Bush administration had a mandate, and he moved ahead with this mandate and its budget, which was notable for tax cuts to the tune of about $1.8 to $1.7 billion. Then 9/11 interceded. It was followed by a short and shallow recession, and then a war in Iraq, which cost us dearly. The surplus of $236 billion in fiscal 2000 became a deficit of $412 billion. From $236 billion in the black, in surplus, to $412 billion in the red, in deficit. $648 billion. A swing of $648 billion in 5 years. Over 8 years, the Bush administration deficits added $5 trillion to the national debt, almost doubling the public debt. So those who want to do something about entitlements, and I do and think we must, need to realize, as we preached during the Bush years, the first and most compelling entitlement is debt service. It has to be paid, and we racked up a bundle of it in the first 8 years of the Bush administration. Bush deficits were beginning to taper off in 2007. When first Martin Feldstein, then Larry Summers, then Ben Bernanke all came to us warning of ominous signs on the horizon for a receding economy. The words of Larry Summers, which he published in an op-ed piece in the Financial Times, quote, as important as long-run deficit reduction is, fiscal policy needs to be on standby to provide immediate relief through spending or tax benefits for low and middle income families if the situation worsens. Still, whatever we did, he said, should be timely, it should be targeted, and it should be temporary. Once again, the problem is that there's not one simple solution to this multivariate equation. There are several. We need a short-run solution and a long-run solution. We need both in place at the same time. That gives you some idea of the complexity of what this problem is. By now, Democrats were in the majority. When the Speaker and the Majority Leader went down to the White House to discuss this ominous development on the economic horizon, they found that the White House was not only concerned, but it was ready to move a bigger counter-cyclical package else they contemplated. In April 2008, as a result, $600 rebates were in the mail. But these were modest medicine compared to what lay over the horizon and was manifest by September of 2008. The economy had begun to slide, and the titans of American capitalism began to fall like dominoes. Lehman Brothers, AIG, Wachovia, GM, Countrywide, Merrill Lynch, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. The cancer started with subprime mortgages, that metastasized into derivatives and other debt instruments, and approached being the worst economic situation since the Great Depression. With November elections over and a Democratic president and a mandate, and the ability to move policy, the leadership of the House met again. And gave me the task of calling Bernanke again and asked him to come testify and tell us what he thought should be the next step by way of fiscal policy, since it was clear that monetary policy, which is limited anyway, was pretty near the end of its tether, especially after the enactment of the Troubled Asset Relief Program. Bernanke agreed to come, agreed to testify, and when he did, he came down in favor of more fiscal stimulus. Now, his imprimatur was important, vitally important to us. But when he testified in December of last year, I don't think Ben Bernanke really had in mind what it was. Because within months, the stimulus and recovery bill packed with $787 billion of tax cuts and spending increases passed the Congress and went to work trying to rejuvenate or pump up the economy. The jury's still out on what that massive initiative has accomplished, but by comparing our economy to Europe's today, it appears that ours is showing more vigor, more vitality. If so, it's probably attributable to some extent to the Recovery Act. Now, back now to the deficit. As we take these unprecedented steps to stop this economy from falling into a deep, protracted recession, the bottom line of the budget has swollen to unprecedented size. It's projected to be as much as $1.8 trillion, 1 year, $1.8 trillion by the end of this year. But here's our dilemma. If we'd done little or nothing, the deficit could easily be worse. We could be headed into a Japanese-type recovery, which is weak and sluggish. Just 2 weeks ago, Mr. Bernanke told our budget committee that, quote, we expect economic activity to bottom out and then turn up later this year. But he went on to warn, quote, even after the recovery gets underway, the rate of real economic growth is likely to remain below its long-term potential for a while, only gradually gaining momentum. The old locomotives that have always driven our economy out of the rut, gas, real estate, and automotives are unavailing now, which makes our role, the government's role, all the more necessary. The good news about our swollen deficits is that most of the swelling is due to non-recurring one-time events. The TARP, most of which is invested in preferred stock and should be recovered. Consolidation of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac into the budget, a one-time event. The Recovery Act, another one-time event, some of which should be recovered if it fires up the economy, which now leaning well below its full potential. That's why we can credibly say in our budget this year the one we passed just weeks ago. That's why we can credibly propose the budget resolution we passed. The deficit will drop from $1.8 trillion this year to $1.1 trillion next year, and on to $523 billion in 2013. Now, I didn't come here this morning to tout a $523 billion deficit. It's still way too high. Even if you say, to put it in context, compared to where we started, 523 is not bad. From $1.8 trillion to $523 billion is an accomplishment if it indeed is achieved. In addition, when we get to 523, it's 3% of GDP. I still think that our next order of business needs to be, most clearly, of course, the economy is taking a deficit reduction effort to address the $500 billion remainder in 2013. Furthermore, over the time that it takes to reach this deficit of $525 billion, the government will rack up trillions of dollars more in debt, and debt service, as I said earlier, is one inescapable entitlement. It has to be paid, or our credit collapses, and so does the economy. In the meantime, other entitlement issues like Medicare and Social Security, which are of concern in your me this week, they hang fire and await attention. Everybody knows that sooner or later, and better sooner, the long-run solvency of these programs has to be dealt with. But many will argue with you now, timing is essential, and this is not exactly the best of times. It's not easy to go tell American annuitants and those expecting their Social Security annuity that once they have their 401ks cut, decimated by the recession, now they're going to have Social Security cut. It is not an easy proposition to sell. And as for Medicaid and Medicare, here's a core problem in the American economy today. 16% of our GDP and growing each year at a rate 2.5 percentage points above the rest of the economy. We've got to find somehow a solution to these two problems if we're going to work our way out of the deficit and also resolve the healthcare entitlements problem. Marcus has got the CBO flat chart which shows you the problem. Typically we think of this as being a problem created by the baby boomers, but in truth, if you look along the line, Social Security is pretty flat as a percentage of GDP. Medicare and Medicaid, however, go up and up and up. So they are accommodating the new beneficiaries of Medicare and Medicaid, but at the same time increasing, as I said earlier, about 2.5 percentage points above inflation in the rest of the economy. Compound that over time, and you can readily see we simply can't sustain it. We have an unsustainable situation. Preferred solution is, as Pete Orszag said, to bend the cost curve. But that's a difficult thing to do. That's going to be the principal concern of the Congress for the next several months, trying to push universal health care, but doing it in a way that does not in itself make the bottom line of the budget even worse. To that end, we have provided, as the President requested, that in fixing Medicare and fixing health care, whatever we do to expand the program to include the 45, 46, 47 million people who don't have coverage today, whatever we do will be fully paid for and offset according to the pay-go rule. That's both a provision of the President's request to us in the Congress and a provision built into the concurrent budget resolution. That doesn't make it an easy task by any means of it. As I said, part of my purpose in showing you all this is to show you not just the policy complexity, but the political complexity of it as well. You can sit back and say it's easy. I can see what you got to do. You got to cut this. You got to cut that. You got to make the bottom line equal to your resources. But it's not that easy. It's not that easy to find something that is just and equitable, at the same time politically viable. That's what lies before us today. Marcus, do you have any more? A couple more charts. Put those up one by one, and we'll wrap up to showing you a few of our charts to illustrate the points that I've been making. Mr. Minerick, you're David the dollar short. This shows you by pie chart the division of the federal budget, and you can see how much of the federal budget is in entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid being the main entitlement programs, but altogether they constitute 12% plus 6% is 42% there. Then you got net interest, which is $195 billion, and much lower than it would be if we had market interest rates. It's still a substantial sum out of the budget in a widened way. And you got defense discretionary. We're effectively spending about $700 billion a year to defend the interests of the United States of America. It is a substantial sum of money. And you've got the other entitlements, mainly Social Security. What you got next? This shows you all of the entitlement program. Projected entitlement spending this year is $2.4 trillion. A large sum of money, to say the least. You can see what it is: unemployment insurance, SSI, farm programs, nutrition, refundable tax credits, family support. It's not just Social Security, it's not just retirement, it's not just health care, it's a variety of different things like farm price support. Here again is the chart we've shown you before. CBO was so taken with this chart. It's simple, it's understandable. They must have run it 2 or 3 times on the front of publications they issued because they thought it summed up in a simple graph the situation in our economy today created by healthcare, the cost of healthcare, the rising cost of healthcare. As you can see, it doesn't quite illustrate there, but the cost of healthcare is going from current law spending on healthcare percentage of GDP is growing from around 16% to around just under 50% in 2077. We don't get there. This is simply an extrapolation of the numbers that we're experiencing today, but it's obvious that the economy could not afford that amount of money for healthcare or any other program, any other simple program. Is that it? Got one more. And this shows you debt held by the public. You'll see 2 or 3 different numbers. We typically use statutory debt, which is all the debt of the United States. It's between $10 and $11 trillion after 80 years of adding, almost doubling it. Today, the debt held by the public, as opposed to being held by accounts of the federal government, is $6.3 trillion, almost twice what it was in 2001. That's it. Just to give you some idea of the complexity of the problem and of the politics that as we deal with this. If there's time, I'll be glad to answer questions, but I think I probably consume more time than I was allotted anyway.
No, you can take a few questions if you'd like.
Okay. Where'd Joe Leonard go?
Right here.
Okay. You're my backside passenger. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation today, Chairman. I was just wondering if you had any thought about the fact that Social Security, there's no individual entitlement in Social Security, and what that might mean for today's youth.
There's no, if there were no...
No, there isn't. I mean, according to the case law, you're not automatically entitled to Social Security benefits each individual when you pay into it. That
I think anybody who took that literally and proposed on the floor of the House and the Senate to repeal Social Security have to, it wouldn't go anywhere. But the member who proposed it wouldn't have much lifespan left in his political career. I mean, the political support of the program, which makes it a legal necessity for all practical purposes, is founded in the fact that over 40 million people depend upon these benefits for their sustenance. Not all of the 45 million people, but quite a few of them. And for that reason, it is not only unlikely the program will ever be repealed in substantial change, but even moderate changes are difficult to sell to the public. I was here in '83, Jim, you were here in '83, and looking back, that seems like a cinch, like foreordained. But when we came back here from the election that year, nobody was really sure how that matter was going to be solved. And so today it's just as difficult. Social Security compared to Medicare is easy, could be done. Just probably not the best time to do it. As a matter of timing. Of course, people will say it's never a good time to do it. But right now, when 401ks have been decimated and people have lost other investments they've made, Social Security is the last rock on which it stands, and we need, whatever we do, we need to keep it solid and sound.
Right here.
Okay, yes, sir.
Hi, Chairman. Our revenue systems, which rely heavily on the progressive income tax, particularly prone to run deficits in times of economic downturns.
Yeah, is that a question?
Yes. Is that your impression?
Do I think that progressive income taxes contributed to the downturn in the economy?
No, I'm saying when you depend heavily on the progressive income tax as your revenue source, does this make your budget particularly prone to run deficits when there is an economic downturn?
I suppose it does, but let's assume we have a consumption tax. It too would experience diminished revenues, and I guess this consumption tax is some variation on it is the only alternative we have to something like the income tax is a big revenue raiser. You're not going to run the federal government on excise taxes, that's for sure. And even if you did, they too would diminish in recession when particular activity or product subject to the excise tax began to diminish in sales volume. So I don't know that any particular, I'll ask the economists here for a better answer than I can give you that, but I don't think that the progressive income tax aggravates the downturn in the economy.
I wouldn't say
Right?
One of the main purposes of the income tax is that revenue does go down when the economy softens and acts as an automatic stabilizer. It helps prevent the downturn from being more severe than otherwise would be. So the flexibility of the income tax and the associated deficits are actually an advantage of the income tax.
You put up a slide that outlined mandatory spending and discretionary spending. Can you talk a little bit about what those other mandatory and other non-discretionary cuts, what is encompassed in those?
Well, it comes as a surprise to some people. Well, that's not it. The other.
Yeah, no, that is it. The other mandatory and the non-defense discretionary.
Well, other mandatory would be the retirement programs, the civil service retirement, military retirement. That would be the two largest. Could be farm price supports.
And then what would be non-defense discretionary?
There you go.
Oh, that's the non-defense. Where does education and those things fit?
Well, education is not an entitlement. It's a discretionary funding.
So it's in the non-defense discretionary?
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.